Welcome back, friends. You are listening to the Juicebox Podcast. Kenny Fox is here again. Today we're going to talk more about looping, food and carb ratios, fat and protein management, nighttime blood sugar rises, loops, carb entry options and adjustments, and the broader understanding of diabetes, like recognizing patterns, food digestion, and insulin interactions. Kenny is awesome. Check out all of the Fox and the Loop House episodes to learn more about looping and using insulin in general. Please don't forget that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. When you place your first order for AG1 with my link, you'll get 5 free travel packs and a free year's supply of vitamin D. drinkag1.com/juicebox. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Cozy Earth. Use the offer code JUICEBOX at checkout at CozyEarth.com and you will save 40% off of your entire order. Are you an adult living with type 1 or the caregiver of someone who is, and a U.S. resident? If you are, I'd love it if you would go to t1dexchange.org/juicebox and take the survey. Today's episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by the Eversense 365, the 1-year wear CGM. That's one insertion a year. That's it. And here's a little bonus for you. How about there's no limit on how many friends and family you can share your data with the Eversense Now app. No limits. Eversense. If you or a loved one was just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and you're looking for some fresh perspective, the Bold Beginnings series from the Juicebox Podcast is a terrific place to start. That series is with myself and Jenny Smith. Jenny is a CDCES, a registered dietitian, and a type 1 for over 35 years. And in the Bold Beginnings series, Jenny and I are going to answer the questions that most people have after a type 1 diabetes diagnosis. The series begins at episode 698 in your podcast player, or you can go to juiceboxpodcast.com and click on Bold Beginnings in the menu. Hey, Kenny, welcome back.
Hey, Scott.
I appreciate you coming back and doing more content for me here on the whole loop thing, and also, spending time telling people about what you're up to, and hopefully they'll find some value in your new website. What's it called again?
Foxintheloophouse.com.
Foxintheloophouse.com. So what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about food, mostly meals and carb ratio, and maybe any other settings around that.
Okay. Is it important to start with what kind of food you're eating, or does it not matter if a low carb person or eating an American diet or something else?
Good question. People that eat low carb do struggle a little bit and may have to do a couple little tweaks, but generally the rules that I set up here will apply to anyone eating anything. We personally kind of eat around the gamut. We've done low carb here and there. We've done it's kind of standard American diet. My daughter just went to a new school and she's eating in the cafeteria most days for lunch, and that is definitely standard American diet food. Pizza, French fries that apparently count as vegetables. They check a nice box on the list for us to eat healthy. And she even has a juice box or chocolate milk occasionally with her lunch. So she eats that. But then at the same time, at home, we largely eat whole food, vegan, kind of super clean stuff. So I've seen the impact of all the different kinds of food. And what we're talking about here should apply to anything.
Okay. And I might get back to asking you about how the algorithm handles carb ratio for stuff that I assume is harder to bolus for, that food at school versus what you're getting at home.
Yeah, we can start with a little bit of that. The trick here is that Loop models all meals the same to a degree. So it just expects you fit the meal into a certain amount of time. For anyone that's used Loop, you get to tell it if it's a fast, a medium, or a slow meal. And it's going to fit the entire expected carb impact, the lift on your blood sugar inside of that window, or we'll talk about the modified window, but it'll fit it inside basically a short, a medium, and a long amount of time. And most of that lift is expected at the beginning, and then it kind of fades throughout the whole thing. So there's no way to say this is a higher glycemic food other than messing with the duration of those particular foods. But in general, you put in a taco or a 3-hour entry, and it's just going to look the same. It's going to expect the same rise and the same fall at the same time at the beginning of the entry as it will for no matter what you're entering. That will change as we move throughout the meal, but at the beginning, it's all going to look the same. So that can be a little tricky. And I'd say a good caveat for those that are listeners of the podcast, you tend to know what stuff is higher glycemic, what's going to hit a little harder. So there will be times where you might need to bolus a little bit extra up front, and you'd rather let Loop take away basal for the beginning of the meal in return for a little bit bigger bolus, or you need to pre-bolus longer, those kinds of things based on the type of food. All Loop's worried about is that you don't go low, and it's going to treat every meal initially the same.
Is your daughter making decisions like that at school? Is she looking at a plate of food and thinking, at home, this would be 40 carbs. Here, I'm going to say it's 50? Or is it more or less not about the type of food, but more about where she is? Like, I'm here, I'm dealing with this more complex carbs, maybe this more processed food. So I'm just going to be more aggressive. Is there a way you guys think about it?
We have a somewhat unique situation now in that her PE, she has a really short, like half of her PE, a half hour right before lunch, and then a half of PE right after.
Oh.
So it's definitely changed the way we handle some of the more challenging meals like pizza, French fries, Juicebox, and chocolate milk with fruit and vegetables mixed in there.
Yeah.
We just enter what it is, what I count it to be with her. She'll send me a picture, a text at lunchtime, and then we'll just send back the number. And by now she knows most of the meals. And she'll enter them, and we just say if it's all, like a long entry, which most of them are because of the fat content in the food. Plus, she's going into fresh activity right after she eats. So stretching out the impact of the food has been helpful, and it doesn't usually give everything up front, and that works out because she starts shooting up because she has no pre-bolus, and then immediately levels out because she's moving, and then it all kind of settles at the end of the day. So it works out that we don't really pre-bolus going into lunch a lot of times. And so I try not to modify what we count when we go into any meal. Instead, I might say something like, it's going to be 80 grams long or pizza, make sure you give at least this much insulin.
Mm-hmm. And the activity's helping her as well right now.
Yeah, I help her just via text. Yeah. For the most part, I give her a reply back with the amount, and she enters it and moves on. And I would say by now, midway through the school year, she's sitting down, sending me a picture, entering what she thinks it is, bolusing what she needs to bolus, and then whenever we get around to replying, then she edits the entry if needed. But she's getting it right most of the time now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's awesome. So there's a thing that if you don't use Loop, you don't know. You could bolus at 11:30 for 35 carbs, and then 10, 15 minutes later say, oh, should have been 40 carbs, and go back and edit that bolus, tell it it's 40 carbs, and it makes an adjustment with the insulin.
Yeah, that's pretty huge. I think it's really useful for and practical. It's very different than any other system, but it's helpful for kids that might not eat it all. Or Tessa says she maybe doesn't have enough time to finish her food as she heads off to the next class or PE or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And so she can say, oh, never mind, I really only had, half of whatever it was. And it, might predict a low if you had dosed for all of it, but at least the system's going to know, and it's going to do its best to turn off the basal. And so it's really helpful when you need to pivot. And then maybe she needs to eat something because she's going to eventually drop from that extra insulin that it gave. But now we're just telling the system exactly what happened, right? We entered 50, changed it to 30, and then she entered 10 carbs as a, maybe low or preventative low treatment. And so now it thinks there's a total of 40 carbs consumed here instead of the original 50. And so it's not likely to, give too much insulin, maybe even not even recommend any insulin for that second entry to try to catch the low. So it's smarter about what's happening because we told it really what happened. So I find that super helpful. But you can spend a lot of time fiddling with editing carb entries when you're guessing, because a lot of our entries are guesses,
Right. I have to admit that's a feature of Loop that I was a big fan of. So that's pretty awesome. So I guess like big picture, talk about how Loop handles a meal. Like just kind of like, let's build it up from the ground for understanding for people. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Eversense 365. And just as the name says, it lasts for a full year. Imagine for a second a CGM with just one sensor placement and one warm-up period, every year. Imagine a sensor that has exceptional accuracy over that year and is actually the most accurate CGM in the low range that you can get. What if I told you that this sensor had no risk of falling off or being knocked off? That may seem too good to be true, but I'm not even done telling you about it yet. The Eversense 365 has essentially no compression lows. It features incredibly gentle adhesive for its transmitter. You can take the transmitter off when you don't want to wear your CGM and put it right back on without having to waste the sensor or go through another warm-up period. The app works with iOS and Android, even Apple Watch. You can manage your diabetes instead of your CGM with the Eversense 365. Learn more and get started today at eversensecgm.com/juicebox. 1 year, 1 CGM.
Yeah, I think what sets Loop apart from, I think all the DIY systems do this, but from the FDA approved systems, they don't express or give us any detail about how they function. So we can't assume this is how it works. But in Loop, it uses what's called dynamic carb absorption. So you're going to enter the meal, it's going to give you a bolus recommendation, probably in line with your carb ratio. In most cases, it should be, unless it adapts to you falling or rising. So it may add a little more or a little bit less, which is nice. But then what it's going to do, it's not just going to say, okay, great, here's your bolus, let's move on. It's going to say, okay, now I've seen this 50 grams you've given. Now let's make sure that that 50 grams goes away. And it's going to try to track the meal throughout the whole progress, the whole duration of that meal, that time entry you gave it. And what it's doing is it's checking to see how your blood sugar is moving is the main thing. There's two components. There's one that has to do with, your carb ratio and how much insulin you have. Obviously, you shouldn't go super high if you dose the right amount. Mm-hmm. So there is an assumption there that as long as you don't go down too much, you should be, there's food there. But then if you also go up, which most food makes your blood sugar go up because it's hard to time against the insulin, there's that second component. And so as your blood sugar rises, it says, oh, hey, that's food. How much is that food? And it will say, maybe that rise, depending on your settings, may say that rise you just saw was 1 or 2 carbs. So it'll say, okay, you had 50 grams. Now we're down to 48. And then we move on. Your blood sugar moves up again a little bit. And now we're down to 46. And maybe you hold steady for a while. So now we're down to like 40, a couple hours in. So it's subtracting the grams from the carb entry as you go. And so what you'll see on the main Loop screen is there's active carbs as well as active insulin. Same as IOB or COB, carbs on board, insulin on board. But it's tracking both the insulin on board as well as the carbs on board. And what you'll find out is that as long as there's a pretty good balance of the insulin on board and the carbs on board, or as Loop says, active insulin or active carbs, roughly to your carb ratio, then the prediction will be happy. So an example would be if you entered 10 grams, or there's 10 grams of active carbs and your carb ratio is 10-1, and you have 1 unit on board, then in general, the prediction will be happy. You're probably going to go up, come down, and land where you should. There's some other variables in there, but that's generally what's happening. So it's trying to maintain a balance of insulin on board to the active carbs as you move throughout the process. So when that imbalance is off, so whether that means you spiked up real fast and Loop said, hey, that was a lot of carbs. Maybe that was the bulk of the juice or the soda you just drank. So now the active carbs might drop real quick. Well, now Loop says, hey, we just gave this insulin and can't get rid of insulin super fast unless you turn off the basal. So now there's too much insulin for the number of carbs left in this meal. And so it's going to predict a drop. And that can be frustrating for some people where you end up higher initially with your meal, and yet Loop is saying you're going to go low. Mm-hmm. And that can be quite obnoxious for a lot of people.
Does that eventually work itself out normally, or is that a situation that lands you with a higher blood sugar that doesn't come back down for hours and hours?
Yeah, if your settings are good, and we'll talk about how to get there, then it often should work itself out, right? For example, soda or fruit might be kind of a quick hit, and then it's not going to last super long. So you're going to see most of the carbs a lot sooner than you would if you had a piece of pizza. So it should work out pretty well if your settings are relatively dialed in.
Okay.
But the trick is if you end up having a couple settings off, let's say you have too weak of a carb ratio, or we'll talk about this more in the next session a little bit more, but if your ISF is too low, which plays into this calculation, then when your blood sugar pops up initially, Loop might be subtracting too many carbs. You might go from 50 to 30 in a matter of an hour. And like, well, that doesn't make sense. Like whatever you ate is probably going to take longer than like 2 hours for you to digest. So now Loop thinks you have like way too few carbs active and therefore way too much insulin because you just bolus for all of it. And so it'll take a while for Loop to think, oh, you're going to go real low, and you're not. So that's the tricky thing. So we have to pay attention to the settings we're using to get us to a point where the meals are absorbing, is the term Loop uses when it drops or sees the carbs. Uses the term absorb as if you like digested it, basically. So you want to make sure the absorption rate is reasonable, not occurring super fast and not taking super long.
When you talk about, I want to make sure I understand the phrasing and the people listening understand the phrasing. When you talk about the carbs going away, the idea is I put in that this is 50 carbs and my ratio is 1 to 10. So we put in 5 units of insulin. Now it's 5 units of insulin's in for this 50 carbs. And as your blood sugar moves or doesn't move, the expectation is, okay, we've made it a certain amount of time and we're still level. So this much insulin's gone and that much insulin was supposed to cover this many carbs. So this many carbs have been absorbed. So now they're kind of out of the picture and we're left with what's left on both insulin and carb side. And those two keep decaying until eventually they're both out of your system. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's generally the idea. Okay. Yeah. And rises will decay the carbs faster. And then, of course, turning off the basal will decay the basal, the IOB faster, right? So those are the tricks Loop can use. And this is more important when you get into longer meals, right? Because you might have pizza or pasta or something like that maybe some pasta might not hit a whole lot at the beginning. It may be more in the middle or at the end or something like that. And so if you stay level, it's like, oh, well, I'm not seeing all the carbs I thought I'd see at the beginning. So it might start predicting like a little bit of a dip in the middle of your pasta you're having. And so it'll turn off the basal. But then eventually the pasta kicks in and you start rising slowly. And so then it says, oh, okay, yeah, I was still expected there to be, 60 more carbs left in this pasta. And it looks like some of it's coming. So I can probably start giving insulin for this now. Mm-hmm. So there is a window. The safety mechanism is the window of time that that you enter, whether it's a short, a medium, or a long meal. You're giving Loop an amount of time, one, to spread out the expected carb impact for safety, and two, that when you get to the end of that time window, if let's say the system doesn't see all of the carbs, it says, hey, we saw 40 out of the 50 you entered, and we're coming up on the end of our time here. Let's not expect that there's another 10 carbs. Yeah. And or even when you get to the very end, obviously it'd be like, nope, I saw 40, you said 50. I'm not going to expect a rise in the dose for those 10 as soon as your blood sugar starts going up, just for safety reasons. That's why you got to have that time limitation there.
Yeah. So if you overestimate the amount of carbs, but the system feels like we're at the end of this meal and it didn't see all those carbs, it might hold out basal longer, for example, to stop you from getting low or something to that effect.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Yeah. You'll see insulin on board be like, there's not enough carbs to match up to this. So it'll probably pull back, even if you start going up. So if you entered pizza as a lollipop or something in the shorter entries, and it gets to the end of that time, and then that second wave of your fat and protein for pizza kick in, the system's like, well, you don't have any more carbs left because I ran out of time to see them. And so you start going up, and it's not going to give you enough insulin to make you happy with the result, because it's going to simply be, for lack of a better term, correcting. As much as I don't like using that term, it's going to be correcting based on your sensitivity and not expecting any carb impact. But if you go back and say, oh, whoops, I entered the pizza we ate short, I'm going to make it longer, go back to maybe a 5-hour absorption, for example, from a 2, then Loop will say, oh, okay, now our window of time is longer to look for this pizza, and you're going up. And let's see, we've only seen, and it starts doing the math as long your prediction, what happened in the last hour or two, and says, okay, we've only seen 30 carbs of our 50 for this pizza, so you got 20 left. Let's go ahead and start dosing for that, and you're going to get a lot more insulin that way instead of just a mild correction, which I think for general diabetes management, whether you're using Loop or not, is the best way to think about how to quote unquote correct. So instead of worrying about correcting, we're going to think about, what did we get wrong? So if you'd only bolused for 30 carbs, but the pizza really has fat and protein and needs another 20, then this would be the time you go in and dose for that, which is likely to be a much larger bolus than if you had just said, well, my doctor told me to use a correction number of X, might only be 1 unit, but you really needed 2 or 3 for all these carbs. So I feel like it's a much more accurate and helpful way to approach management, whether you're using an automated system or just, bolusing with your pens or whatever. Either way, you want to make sure you're addressing the actual issue, not just correcting randomly.
Yeah. Take a sidebar for a second. Tell me why you don't like the word correcting.
Because of mostly what I just mentioned. So correcting, when you're diagnosed, you get started with a general correction number to play with. And it's blind. It's you're picking a number out of the air to correct because you're high, because you need something to go off of. But if you can take a step back and understand some of the variables at play early on, as fat and protein is the one that people need to become aware of, and you adjust for that, you're going to get better results. One, because you expect it. It's no longer a correction. It's a expected rise that you're dosing for. And two, you're going to get a more accurate and often larger when necessary or smaller when necessary dose of insulin to take care of the problem. Or, for example, if you undercounted a meal, you went out to eat and you guessed what it was, and you're like, no, there's a high likelihood I underguessed the amount of carbs or fat and protein in that particular meal. So it would be best if I thought, how many carbs did I miss on that? And probably 15 more. So then dose for that a couple hours after you've had Mexican food, rather than just using some random correction value that you've been given or sometimes playing with.
Right. Also, I think maybe in a similar vein, tell me what people should be thinking when they bolus for a meal, see the blood sugar rising, and the basal's not there, and they think to themselves, I still need this basal. Why is the basal not there? If the basal was there, I wouldn't be rising so quickly. Like, what should they actually be thinking? Instead of, hey, the dumb machine's not working, they should be thinking.
Okay, so the initial answer would be, until you're used to looking at the prediction and understanding all the elements we're going to go through, all the variables, it might just be in a loop situation, just give more insulin and then take your time to figure out what's wrong. That's the way I react to situations sometimes if it's not apparent to me. But if you're in the middle of a meal, you might want to look at the prediction. Does the prediction say you're going to go up eventually, but you're going to go low here in the next hour? Might be because you have a nice, long, slow entry for your food, and maybe that's not totally accurate for the type of food you have. Or you might not have enough active carbs. You might see that, hey, you entered food like 2 hours ago, and it's a nice, long meal, but yet Loop says like 80% of all your carbs are already absorbed, and it's not expecting a whole lot of lift left in your meal. So I think the appropriate response is, one, we got to give more insulin. Two, we got to figure out how do we fix that. And we'll go over that, but you might look at your carb ratio. You might look at your ISF. The way I do it when we're high, if you're the situation you're talking about, my step is always look back overnight, like we covered in the last episode. Make sure your basal's pretty good, at least based on the, relatively uneventful night. Make the adjustment if you didn't already. Check the pump site, just in case, if you're higher. And then you step into, how confident am I in the food I just entered? Right? If it's stuff you've had before, you know how to account for it, it's fine. Then you move on to the next step. But if it's something out you've never had before, or a new meal you're making, then you might want to adjust your carbs if you think it should be higher or lower than what you're talking about. And then after that, you might take a step and say, fat and protein here, how do we want to address this? And we'll talk about how I enter that here in a minute, but we'll enter some carbs to represent the fat and protein impact. If you've done all that, then it's like, well, am I going high pretty frequently with food? Maybe we need to address the carb ratio. And at the very end, and double check your carb absorption. If you're using too short a meal or too long a meal, we can look at that. Usually too short is what people would do, because you're 3 hours out from a meal and you use something like a fast entry, and Loop's like, okay, we ran out of time for this, but we should not have run out of time. You extend it. And then finally it's, okay, we'll play around with the sensitivity factor, and we'll get to that probably in the next episode and talk about how that helps with the meals. So that's my progression of how to step through from a high, what you go through. But again, the initial gut reaction is, if you think you need more insulin and you're generally pretty good at guessing those things. Just give it, and then we'll figure out how to tweak loop later.
Can you put a number on high after a meal? Meaning, if there's 21 meals a week, where do you not see your daughter crest most of the time? What number does she not get over during a meal normally?
I would say as she has grown larger and using a lot more insulin, she's less sensitive to insulin. She's also less sensitive to food. So we pre-bolus, but it's not super aggressive. Maybe a few minutes sometimes 10 or 15, but not super often. And I would say 150, 160 is, I've learned to let those go and let Loop kind of deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't love it, but it's not super common to hit quite the 160 number without a pre-bolus, I should say. But when she was younger, without a pre-bolus, that would have been much higher. So I think it's a little contextual. But yeah, we're hitting over 160, especially with any kind of speed, any kind of rise. Then I'll bolus, and then we'll double check. And usually it's a text to Tessa to say, so what did you eat again?
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to my order there. How confident are we in the food? Well, if I didn't see it, then I'm less confident in what's entered. So I'll ask her what it was, and she might tell me what it is and be like, oh yeah, you probably undercounted that, for example. If not, then we'll let it go.
Is that where you lean when you see a 160? Like bad count, not bad pre-bolus?
That's a great question. I've talked to some people about this before. If it's a higher glycemic food, then no. Like if we didn't pre-bolus a higher glycemic food, then I'm more apt to say, okay, let's just give a little extra insulin, let Loop turn off the basal, but we probably just didn't time that right.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a timing issue that those that are familiar with the podcast should be comfortable with right now to go, well, we just messed up the timing on that. Otherwise, if it's a home cooked, fairly mild meal and we're getting to 160, that's a little unusual, even at the beginning.
Right.
We'll look at the carb counts, or I'll often just look at the site. Like I mentioned, my list of things I go through.
Yeah. I texted Arden recently and I said, did you just eat a bag of sugar? And she goes, no. And I said, was it 2 bags of sugar? What rocketing am I seeing here? Higher glycemic, quicker acting sugars are probably going to need a longer pre-bolus so that the action of the insulin is really ramped up and vibing, on your side of this thing, because this sugar is going to go in and you're going to jack up really quickly. So you need a lot of power from that insulin to stop that. If it's a more balanced meal and you see that rise like that, then your expectation is we miscounted the carbs. That's right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I've heard you say that before, something.
I've said something like that before, but it fits very well in this conversation. So,
yeah.
Okay. What else you got?
There is a little bit of a trick. I don't actually have in my notes here, but there's a little bit of a trick when they're younger, especially when they're more sensitive to everything. And you can do some small things like, hey, ask your kid to eat the lower glycemic foods first on their plate and kind of rotate around just to give you some more time for pre-bolus, or no pre-bolus, and it's effectively like a mild pre-bolus. There is some tricks for that, but the timing issue is important to not to know when it's a panic of we underdose versus just didn't time it well. I think that's a good highlight that I probably don't spend enough time talking about. So thanks for bringing that up.
No, of course. You brought something up that I'm going to highlight here for a second. Back in 2024 in episode 902, I either got a lot of crap from people or a lot of love from people for having a woman on who calls herself Glucose Goddess on Instagram, right? And in the end, what she was really talking about was the order that you ingest food in and how that can impact the glycemic impact on you, right? Like how it can lessen the glycemic impact on the person eating. And I have to tell you, if you look past the idea of some people jump to conclusions that she was saying stuff that she wasn't saying, if you go listen to what she talks about eating in a certain order, the responses and the replies I got back from people overwhelmingly were, this really worked for me. So if it's a thing you're interested in, there is an order you can kind of eat your meal in that might help that glycemic impact be lessened. So
yeah, we used that, or tried to remember to use that when Tessa was younger, 5, 6, 7. It made a big difference too.
Yeah.
Even if it didn't change it did adjust the glycemic impact, but it was also just practically something to do when socially it was a little bit of a burden to try and pre-bolus, right? It buys you, practically speaking, it buys you more time till you get to the thing that really needs more insulin.
Right.
But like she covered in that episode, it really does change how the food hits if you put something else in your stomach first and then get to the sugary stuff that may require the insulin sooner.
Also, she has a lovely accent. So if you just want to hear a lovely accent for a while, go listen to Jesse and 902. But anyway, I didn't mean to take us off track there, but it came up, and again, like I got a lot of good feedback about that episode from people. So
yeah, it's a really cool trick. I think it was sprinkled into one of your earlier episodes, which is why we started trying it.
Yep.
But that's a long time ago now.
Yeah, no, listen, I've brought it up in the past because, and in fairness, the way I heard about it was just online. People were like, if you eat this before that, then, and then Jenny would start talking about, like, I think it really hit me more when in one of the pro tip episodes where Jenny said to me, like, hey, here's the reason that pizza takes so long in your system. And she started talking about how, like, the cheese and the grease slowed down digestion. And I was like, well, that's the first time I really wrapped my head around that. It's a long time ago now, but it's important to remember, because I don't know how you're supposed to do all this if you don't recognize that French fry that's deep fried is going to impact you later when you don't expect it to. And, don't expect it to if you're going by what your doctor said, which was like, count the carbs, put in the insulin, everything's going to be fine. You count the carbs, you get them right, you put the insulin in, and, lo and behold, 90 minutes later, blood sugar's going up with some speed and steadily, and seems like you can't impact it, and you can't figure out why. Understanding fat and protein is a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. I'll mention how we tend to dose for fat and protein, and a lot of this is derived from experience, and then a lot of stuff on the podcast. You had a couple people on. One lady I remember talking about the Warsaw method, the kind of fancy calculation for converting basically kind of calories of fat and protein into some kind of carb equivalent.
Yep. Episode 471.
471, yeah. Yeah, I like how she simplified it, and so I kind of use something similar. So what we do for fat and protein, this is the way I have Tessa do it, is we'll do the fat grams and the protein grams, add them together, and then just divide it by 3. It's a simple math step. I think more appropriately, the fat needs a little more insulin than the protein. So you might do like a 40 or 50% of fat grams as carbs, and then protein maybe more like 20. But for Tessa, what I tell her to do is, hey, if you have a nutrition label or you start guessing on her own, which she's learning to not just carb count, but fat count and protein count, same thing you do is over time, you acquire a little mental database of this stuff. And just say divide by 3 is a place to start. It works out well enough. But if the meal is going to be higher fat, restaurant food, for example, is usually much more fatty, then, you can round up, or you can do a more precise calculation, whatever works. But I find that 1/3 of both is a good place to start. And then we use longer entries. So the pizza icon in Loop is 5 hours. We use that for most food, especially if the fat and protein kind of quote carbs represents, I should come up with a better number, but at least 10 to 20% of the total carb count is fat and protein. It's probably better to use something a little bit longer, whether it's 4 or 5 hours in time on Loop. That's helpful. And there's a couple different ways that we approach how we enter the food. I'll give you the complicated way that's probably the best, and then we'll step into the kind of practical way, what I have Tessa do to keep it simple for her. You could take the different absorption times. You could enter, really short, maybe 1 or 2 hour absorption in Loop for all the sugars. And then you could do 3 hours for the remaining carbs. And then you could move out into the future. With Loop, you can enter food and change the time that you're going to quote consume it, basically when the impact's going to start. And you could, roll it out to the future 2 hours from right now, and put in your fat and your protein representation as a nice slow pizza entry, which is great. So then you end up having like 3 or 4 entries just for one single meal, which creates a nice profile, a predicted rise for Loop to play on to handle the meal really well. But that's a lot of entries, and practically speaking is just not something we do a whole lot. So then the next most easy method that we use with good success, but it's really only something I do when I'm entering the food, is we'll enter the carbs as one entry. And if it's a lot of, pretty basic glycemic carbs, we'll do a 3 hour entry. If there's a lot of fat involved in the meal, we'll use a longer one. So you kind of play with the first entry, the right now entry. And then we'll do a future entry 2 hours ahead. and use a nice long slow absorption, the pizza icon, and enter that fat and protein calculation I mentioned, the 1/3 of the fat and the protein grams.
Yeah.
So we do 2 entries per meal. That works great.
I was going to say Jenny loves that one.
Yeah.
She talks about that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the best balance I find. But when I'm texting Tessa, I've had her say, hey, do this entry and this entry. Tell her 2 entries and she'll do it.
Right.
But we've played around with, ever since the defaults in Loop changed from a 4 hours as a long entry to 5, it's a better representation of a long meal. So what we often do is we'll just do the whole thing as one entry. So the carbs and then 1/3 of the fat and protein added into the carbs and just put it in as a pizza entry.
Mm-hmm.
And answer it and go. And Tessa's typically eating enough now and frequently and enough volume that it's fine. It doesn't usually cause a problem. When she was younger and more sensitive, I think the split entry that I just mentioned, the second option, it creates a nice spread out impact. So it's less likely to bolus too much on a little kiddo. So those are the 2 methods we use. I would say we use 1 entry a lot. And then if she starts to get a little bit high, like 4 or 5 hours after the meal, and Loop's kind of running out of time, we'll talk about the time here in a second, but if it's running out of time for the entry, then we'll go ahead, I'll add a few more carbs later, kind of as a second entry after the fact.
Yeah.
Because it does happen that the pizza entry is not long enough for really long foods. It's good enough for most of them, but it's not long enough for most really long meals.
What's your expectation when you talk about now that she's older? Why do you think her sensitivity is different with age?
I mean, she's using more insulin, and in Loop, we'll talk about in the next session here. There's an idea around carb sensitivity, and you can get to it using the settings we have. But all I have to say is I think her carb sensitivity and insulin sensitivity are lower, and they tend to scale together. So just in practice, I've seen her spike less as she's used more insulin, or it's more forgiving if we don't pre-bolus. We can catch up with it a little faster.
Do you think that's body mass?
I think so. I think both body mass and insulin resistance / sensitivity, because she's on the 90% of her growth chart.
Mm-hmm.
So she is taller and bigger for her age. But her insulin needs are, from what I've seen from other 10, 11-year-olds, a good amount more, maybe 20 to 50% more than the average too. But I've just noticed it when she started using more insulin in the last year and a half. Right. It just started getting easier. And the other people I've been helping over time is, as they use more insulin, things get a little bit easier in terms of the responsiveness is less extreme on both ends of both a heavy bolus or the spiky foods. It just tends to be more mild over time.
Is forgiving the right word? It's more forgiving?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I think another way to think about it is 1 gram, let's say 1 Skittle, would move Arden's blood sugar a lot less now than it did when she was 4.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh no, sure. I could a quarter of a juice box could fix a low at some point. Now you just need to drink the whole thing and
exactly.
And hope that was enough sometimes. Okay.
Yeah. I think that plays into it. So the more technical piece we missed a little bit, I'll mention a bit, is the absorption time. This is one of those things that can feel a little funny when you enter 3-hour or 5-hour, whatever duration you're going to use. Loop says, great, I hear you on the 3 hours, let's say. But just in case you're wrong, spike might be too much. Again, it's a very hyposensitive system. It's going to say, I see your 3 hours, but I'm going to add 50% to this, what I'm calling the window of time to see the food. So the 3 hours becomes 4.5. You're adding 1.5 hours to that. So half of the 3, add 50%. So you're at 4.5 hour window. So whenever you say this is a 3-hour food, you're really telling Loop, I'm giving you 4.5 hours to see this meal, but Loop is also spreading out the expected rise from that food over 4.5 hours, not the 3 that you entered. So that can feel a little funny when you're telling it one thing, but it's kind of doing another. But that's important to know that that's your maximum window for seeing those carbs. And that's why I mentioned the 5-hour, the slow option, being better for longer meals. It gives you about a 7.5 hour window of time to see all the food. But if it's fatty enough, Jenny's covered it plenty on the pro tips, it's going to last longer than that 7.5 hours. So sometimes you do need kind of a second entry to cover the fat and protein, which is why that option 2, as I discussed for entering carbs, often works out better, is you're moving the fat and protein out 2 hours for the lift, that rise that's supposed to happen. And then you're basically giving it an extra 2 hours of runway to see all that impact. So that's pretty helpful.
Trying to see if I can see back far enough last night to tell you that we went out last night kind of late, like 9 p.m. to a bar restaurant that had French fries. And Arden's blood sugar was 70 when we got there. It was 120 for 5 hours afterwards. And as soon as her algorithm kind of gave her a little bit of a low at like 2:30 in the morning, she wasn't actually low, but she kind of went back down to 70. So it kind of took away some basal once it felt like the meal was over and like to try to stop the low. But as soon as it took the basal away, she shot up to 200. And that is because that fat is still in there from the French fries and the meal from like 6 hours prior. Now, the Arden's using Trio, not Loop, but it attacked it just with basal. And inside of 35 minutes went from 70 to 200 and back down to 90 again, just with basal. And if I showed you the Night Scout, you'd see that she hadn't had basal running since, my gosh, she ate at 3 p.m. So there's a bolus at 3 p.m. She had only had basal maybe twice between 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. And then after bolusing at 9 p.m., didn't have basal again until the spike at 3 a.m. And then
like around midnight.
Yeah. And then eventually overnight, after the food was all gone, then her basal came back on and started working the way you would expect it to again. There's an argument to be made that that meal had something to do with her blood sugar for about 10 hours. Like watching. For sure. Yeah. It's really, really something else.
We've gone out to restaurants and had a meal that we thought was relatively contained, but it basically sent her higher. Like you could have argued it was basal, but we knew it was the food until she woke up the next morning. Mm-hmm. Like it created this resistance that had like a little bit of a, not massive, but lingering resistance where she might float around 120 or 100 and her target was more like 90. And Loop's just trying to like knock it down most of the night. And it didn't quite stick until she woke up. And, you know, it does. Then the next day, everything's fine. The next night, everything's fine. No need to change basal, but it was just the food. So yeah, it can stick around for a long time. So a lot of Tessa's entries are longer. I'd say that like a lot of days, more than half of her entries are using that pizza icon, and the meals are kind of stacking on top of each other. So she has active carbs all day long. And that's part of the thing we discussed where once you get the basal right and you dial it down to where it needs to be, you're clear in the fog. You can see more variables. Fat and protein is a big one where now you can see that you're not covering that with basal. A lot of people and doctors, I hear them do the same thing. I talked to some endos up at our diabetes camp, and anytime there's kind of this pattern of going up, which might mean that you're just eating the same thing every day and there's fat and protein, any mystery that they don't understand, they tend to attack with a little bit of a basal increase. And then when you change up your rhythm, what it is you're eating, you end up going low over time. So pulling that mystery away and understanding what that is huge to being successful and being able to eat whatever, whenever.
Yeah, I think so too. You were talking earlier about how Tessa just starts to like understand to make that second bolus maybe, or the fat is her. I was going to talk about how excited I was the first time that I saw future boluses set up by the algorithm. And I knew that meant Arden put a fat count into her initial meal. And I was like, oh God, she's doing it. You know, like,
and then the next time they don't, but yeah.
Yeah. No, trust me, she's not super consistent with it, but I've seen her do it a lot, you know, where I'm not misremembering. This is in Loop as well as Trio, or just it is, right? Like you can say there's this many carbs in the meal, this much fat in the meal, this many.
Yeah, I think Trio gives a spot to actually enter those breakouts, whereas Loop, you have to just enter carbs. But
right.
Yeah.
So with Trio, like she can say, like this meal's 50 carbs, but I think there are 25 grams of fat in this meal too. And then it will set up boluses out in the future, almost like every hour for a number of hours. And when I see that pop up on the Night Scout, I'm like, oh, she's thinking about it.
Wonderful. Yeah. It's wonderful. Yeah. Them growing up is good. It's tricky. I did have a couple people say, I don't want to learn how to count all over again. It's like, well, I mean, you learn carb counting pretty fast. You can start looking some things up and figuring out the fat and the protein. So yeah, it's a good adjustment.
Just say to her, listen, in my mind, I just say to her, like, deep fried. If you're going to have something deep fried, like just, I don't know, at least 20. You know, for fat, like just do that. And so
another thing I see is people entering fake carbs to fight a high, which can be fine to use if you feel it's needed or if you feel like you undercounted a meal. I find people make that a habit sometimes. They start entering fake carbs when they're running higher, or they start undercounting things when they put stuff in loop when they think their settings are. I don't know if they think of their settings as being off, but when they're running lower, is they're adjusting their carb counts. And that can be fine in the moment. But if you really want to use the system and the data to make a decision, you'll eventually need to go back and fix those. And one way you can do that is looking at the ICE screen, which is the insulin counteraction effect, or most people know it as you tap on that green graph of carbs and you get a list of all your carb entries, the carbohydrate screen. That screen is helpful if your settings are relatively decent, but what you may have to do is you go back in and you delete the extra carbs you put in and get everything back entered the way you think is right. And then you can tweak your settings and come back and look at that screen again and use it as a guide for, if I had a stronger carb ratio, how many carbs would Loop think these meals took, for example? And if I change my ISF, what does that do? So it's a good learning screen, but you have to make sure that you're putting in reasonable amounts and not just pivoting based on, how the day feels. It's fine to do in the moment, especially if your kid's like mine and she's texting me. I'm like, well, I guess you have been running lower and I don't want to text her 2 or 3 times to adjust her basal. I don't want to bother her. So I might say, sure, we'll take 10 carbs off lunch, but we don't do that very often. It's usually like lower your basal by, 0.05 and then, then give her the real carb counts. And then we move on, kind of what I do at lunchtime. So that's something to pay attention to. I see a habit people develop.
But even though, Kenny, when you talk about like counting carbs, you're still just estimating based on your knowledge, right? You're not actually like calling the school and being like, how many carbs are in this? Like you figured it out over time, or did you call them initially?
The school actually has a meal plan set up. So every food that they have, I can go on the website and look at their estimated fat, protein, and carb counts. They have nutrition facts posted for everything. I don't know how accurate they are and how consistent they are in their portions, but it gives me some place to start, and then we adjust from there.
Okay,
for sure.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What do you got left here?
One tip that I think has been really helpful for people and a better tip for managing those nighttime rises. You mentioned in the last episode when your kid goes to sleep, especially when they're younger and they go shooting up. I had a way of managing it. And just this year, I learned some information that actually made it make more sense. So I was reading about circadian rhythm of your body for health reasons. And one of the things it mentioned is that when we eat in the morning, our body will, digest the food, convert all of it right now, all the carbs to sugar, and use it, power our brain, our muscles, all that throughout the day. As we get closer to sleeping time, our body knows that we'll be fasting, we'll be not eating overnight. And so what happens is a portion of the food we eat starts to be stored as fat for consumption later. And I feel like that hit me. It was like, that explains why if we have the same food at lunch as we do at dinner, for example, the spike isn't as strong at dinner most of the time, and we're often fighting lows before bed, or sometimes fighting lows before bed. It just feels like the food doesn't hit the same from lunch as it does to dinner. And so what we've been doing is I didn't want to back off on the carb ratio. A lot of people weaken the carb ratio for dinner as a result, but what I found works now to represent this biologic effect is that you just use longer absorption. So if you use a medium, like a taco entry at lunch, then try the pizza one, like a 4 or 5 hour absorption at dinner. If you normally use pizza, like a 5 hour absorption at lunch, then try 6 when you go to have it for dinner. And so what happens is you get less insulin up front. It generally helps mitigate the lows you have before bed. At the same time, saves a lot of active carbs and a nice long window of time for when that rise does show up after your kid goes to sleep or you go to sleep, either way, that it has a lot of active carbs that it still expects to show up and can start hammering away at that when the rise occurs. So it's created a lot more consistency for us and for the other people I've mentioned this to, where now it's not, again, we're doing fat and protein and everything in those entries, but it creates a lot more consistency where I don't have to be manually bolusing a really aggressive rise. Loop already wants to give, in my case, multiple units as she's going up. So I don't have to be like, here's a 5-unit bolus to try to knock down this rise that's coming. The system wants to do it. And so if I don't pay attention, it's usually relatively contained. It might not be perfectly in time and range, but it's much better than it used to be when we started Loop. And I just felt like the magic was having that Apple Watch where she could go to sleep and then as soon as she goes to sleep, I would just like take the watch and bolus a bunch of units while I'm trying to clean the kitchen or do laundry with my wife as the kids are in bed. I just thought that was magical. But now if we've sort of represented this rise more appropriately and mitigated the lows before bed, that now I don't have to do that as much anymore.
Okay. I feel like we should say, because we haven't so far, for people who haven't used Loop, when you hear Kenny saying like pick taco or pizza so there's little emojis in the app that signify different absorption times for the food. So that's what he's saying. Like when he says pick taco or pick a pizza, are those the ones you use most of the time?
Yeah, I'm using taco and pizza. Yeah, the lollipop is considered the fast stuff. The default for that is 30 minutes of absorption. Now it got changed in the last couple of years. I always make it longer. I change it in the code and make it, 1.5 or 2 hours. We tend not to use that. I do use that for fruit. That's the one thing that's tricky in here. He's just talking about food that has a lot of fiber. And one of the tricky things I found about fruit is you might look up like what's the carb count for a medium apple, and it'll tell you something like 20 or 25 grams of carbs. But that's only true if you were to blend it up with an industrial blender and smash all the cell walls that contain all the sugar into bits and extract every ounce of sugar out of it. But I know my kid's not chewing her apple that thoroughly to extract all the sugar found in that apple.
Right.
So I find that's one reason that fruits and vegetables are a little more variable and should usually be less than whatever I Google or whatever the amount of carbs it should be.
Yeah.
Is that my kid's not going to chew it up the same way. So I'll use a shorter time entry so that there's less chance that like 4 hours out, Loop thinks that, oh, well, you haven't seen all the carbs for that apple. So if you keep it short, Loop limits the amount of time it'll expect that fruit to hit. And so then you don't have to worry about overcounting it quite as much. And then I also usually pick a number less than whatever it is I look up for most foods that I, again, don't think she's going to be chewing like she's a high-speed blender.
It's interesting while we're talking today, a couple of things are occurring to me. The one is that there could be people listening who are just like, well, this Kenny guy's overthinking all this. I don't see any of the things that he's talking about, but I would ask you to believe that, and maybe this is okay, but frequently some of the successes you have with diabetes are by mistake. And you know what I mean? Just like the failures are not always obvious where they came from, but you could not understand some of this and still be seeing stability and thinking like, oh, I understand this, but you could just be getting lucky. Like, look what we talked about, like the circadian rhythm of like how your body stores food depending on what time of day it is. Like that's a thing that you might have built up a rhythm with and you might not know that you understand that rhythm. Right. Like, so I don't know. It's interesting to me because I feel like as much as this conversation is about how Loop works and how to use Loop, it's really just as much, if not more, about how your body works, how it interacts with the food and your exercise and the other things that impact your blood sugar and how insulin work. Like the Loop is almost inconsequential in the conversation, as crazy as that sounds. Like that's not really what you're learning about while you're talking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Loop, because of its design, is a little more simplistic in terms of like it's just modeling everything. So we just adjust the understanding to make Loop kind of do what we understand. And yeah, I think like the circadian rhythm thing was just something I encountered this year for another unrelated reason. I just happen to have diabetes experience to layer on top of it. So it's a lot. It can feel technical, but once you wrap your head around it, it's something you can adjust to pretty well. And like I said before, with any system that you're managing with, you understand these variables. You can use that system to your advantage in that way. And you mentioned activity, and I'll just throw that in here too, that sometimes you need to not enter all the carbs in for activity. And we'll cover that more in more detail. But that's one space that I find some parents with active kids, they don't do that fat and protein thing we talk about for like lunch at school, for example.
Yeah.
They'll do it for dinner because those rises are going to show up for sure, but they won't do it at school. But yeah, exactly. This is all about understanding biology, and the more we can understand it, the better decisions we can make with whatever system, however we're managing diabetes.
I think I'd like to make this point to simplify. If you're a baseball person, you watch baseball on television, you wonder, like, in the last handful of years, like, where'd all these guys come from that throw 98 miles an hour from? Like, that used to be a special few people, right? You need to be Nolan Ryan. You need to be like a guy like that, like to be that special. Where that came from is a lab out in Seattle called Driveline who figured out that, yeah, Nolan Ryan was special, but it might have had a lot more to do with like how his fingers were shaped or how his arm moved. And that's a thing we could teach to other people. So like there are a lot of big, strong guys who are built about like this, that if we teach them the correct mechanics, turns out that ball comes out just the same, right? So it's not as magical as you thought it was back when it was a handful of people in the league who were special at this. We can teach you how to throw the ball this way, and they're doing it. Now, diabetes to me is kind of the same way. Like you can't look up and just think, oh, some people are just better at this than I am, or it just works for them. You know what I mean? Like there is a way to have the same results that you're seeing with other people all the time. It's the basis for the podcast, for my money. Like, if you've listened for a while, you've heard me say forever that when I started this, people told me that I couldn't share my daughter's successes because it would make others feel badly. And what I said was, I think it should make them feel like it's possible, and they should maybe try to figure out what the hell I did. So like that to me is what we're talking about here. Like Kenny's not a special person. I mean, listen, he's delightful and he's eloquent. And he talks about this stuff in a way that is obvious that he has a deep understanding of it and a lot of practice with it. But you don't need to understand it as well as Kenny does to have the results that Kenny's having with his daughter. That's my expectation. So, Kenny, people have been listening to this podcast for a long time. You understand this in a completely different way than I do. Like my brain does not work the same way yours does. And the truth is that if somebody told me right now at the end of this recording, go back and tell me everything Kenny said, I won't be able to do that. But I can listen to you, translate what you said into how my brain works, and then use that in my daughter's life. So I think a lot of people have that possibility in front of them as well. I appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Eversense 365 for sponsoring this episode of the Juicebox Podcast and remind you that if you want the only sensor that gets inserted once a year and not every 14 days, you want the Eversense CGM. EversenseCGM.com/juicebox. 1 year, 1 CGM. Hey, thanks for listening all the way to the end. I really appreciate your loyalty and listenership. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. If you're looking for community around type 1 diabetes, check out the Juicebox Podcast private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast, type 1 diabetes. But everybody is welcome. Type 1, type 2, gestational, loved ones, it doesn't matter to me. If you're impacted by diabetes and you're looking for support, comfort, or community, check out Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes on Facebook. The episode you just heard was professionally edited by Wrong Way Recording. WrongWayRecording.com.